Welcome everybody to today's webinar, Increasing Your Journal's Discoverability with Better Metadata. Thank you so much for joining. Just a short introduction. I'm Stephanie Dawson, head of ScienceOpen, a discovery environment with over 76 million records for articles, books, chapters, and more. Some of those articles have a rich set of information available, such as abstracts, references, keywords, and author affiliations. Those articles are deeply networked within our discovery environment and are viewed more often than articles that only have a very minimal set of information like title and author. Today, I would like to explain to you how this rich metadata affects the discoverability of, and in the long run, the impact of your research. So let's start with the basic unit of discoverability, the Digital Object Identifier, or DOI. A DOI is a stable identifier that links to the article or book homepage or URL. And because URLs tend to change over time as publishers update their website or change platforms or journals are bought or sold or moved, the DOI remains stable and you can always then find that article. So with a DOI, the publisher just needs to let the platform, the DOI service, know the new article URL, and all links will continue to work smoothly to take you to the article you are looking for. The institutions managing DOIs for academic publishing are Crossref and DataCite. Just as a heads up, there are other DOIs out there in the world. There are DOIs for video content, DOIs for other kinds of content. So when we're talking about academic content, DOIs for academic content, the two main sources of those DOIs are Crossref and DataCite. When publishers deposit a DOI and the corresponding URL, they also add some information about the article that can help to identify it. This metadata about the article includes publication date, journal title, volume, issue, authors, but it can also include other things like abstracts, author affiliations, and ORCID IDs, references, open access license, funder name, grant number, and more. This metadata can be made publicly available so that services like ScienceOpen can then query a DOI to access the extended information about it and link to the version of record. For both publishers and authors, this metadata is the business card for your article, as it were, and is used by a wide range of services. So just maybe to give you a little bit of background on how the ScienceOpen platform works. So whenever a new article comes into the platform, we analyze the references, we do a lookup in our own database. If we've seen that DOI before, we increase the citation index. If not, we go to Crossref or we go to DataCite and we pull in the publicly available metadata and create a new record for that article. So that metadata that we pull in can either be very, very rich or very, very slim, depending on what kind of metadata the publisher deposited with that record at the DOI service. So we use this Crossref metadata to enrich the article record. We show the references with DOIs, we track citations, we use the abstract and keywords for search and for our similar article recommendation engine. We work together with the company Altmetrics to track online usage as an Altmetric attention score. And Altmetric can only track articles with a DOI. So for a discovery environment like ScienceOpen, the most important metadata fields, sort of beyond super basic ones like author, title, journal, are abstract, references, open access license, keywords, affiliation, and funder. What does poor metadata look like on ScienceOpen? Here you can see an example. There's no references, no abstract, no affiliations. So it's a really quite slim record. I think this article is perhaps even an open access article, but there's no license information. So that's the kind of information that would be really, really helpful for potential readers of this article. On ScienceOpen, we use the available metadata to make a better search experience. So being able to filter for open access is one key feature on the platform. However, one piece of metadata that's often missing is a machine readable open access license. ScienceOpen only flags articles as open access and makes that a filterable category for articles with a machine readable Creative Commons license tagged in the metadata. We do not try to guess if a journal is open access because we saw a similar title on DOIJ, or send a bot to try and access a PDF only to call something open access that was only freely available on that day because the paywall was down. If an author retains the copyright and publishes their article CC BY, then that information should certainly be tagged in the article metadata deposited with Crossref data site. If your article is open access and does not have an open access symbol on ScienceOpen, get in touch and we can try and discover what step that metadata is missing. We've seen everything. A CC BY license printed in the PDF, for example, is not machine readable. Remember, freely accessible PDF does not mean that computers know what they're allowed to do with the article. Metadata is usually tagged and stored as XML, either a Dublin Core or JATS, to ensure the easiest interoperability. So if you want to get a sense of how interoperable your metadata is, ScienceOpen is a good place to look. So you can just check your content on ScienceOpen and see how rich are those records, are there open access licenses missing, and if you find that things are missing, then that ScienceOpen is a good place to start to get in touch to find out maybe where's that going wrong. Today I'm talking about journal discoverability, but of course, much of what I'm saying also goes for books. We'll be running a similar webinar for book metadata in the near future, so that's another topic in and of itself. We can use the metadata that we discover, that we can use the metadata that we have sort of behind the scenes on our platform, and to create automatically curated collections, such as this one on the UN Sustainable Development Goals or the Climate Change Open Access Collection. We draw on keywords, abstract, and title. And articles promoted in a topical collection are much more likely to be viewed or shared on ScienceOpen and to be indexed in Google. Another example of how metadata can make a difference, the UCL library has created an automated collection to gather together research from their faculty and students on COVID-19. Articles that don't have any information in the affiliation sections will not be included automatically. Somebody might find it by hand, this information, and be able to add them manually, but we're talking about a lot of data out there in the world. And if you want to be sure that your article is included, not only on ScienceOpen, but in lots of different services out there, if you want to ensure that it's included automatically, then having a rich set of metadata is going to be your best ticket. Affiliation data is used as well to support new business models for open access. For example, libraries might like to know if any researchers from their institution have published in a particular journal. If you can, with one click, search University College London and see if there are any authors publishing in this journal, that makes that job a lot easier. If that information is tucked away in a PDF in a nice, really nice looking bio section of a PDF, that's going to be hard to at scale search for and find that data and deliver that data to the people who need to make a decision. So always thinking about how machine readable is the information in your journal is super important. It's just the case that computers don't care so much how your PDF looks. Probably one of the most powerful pieces of metadata is the abstract to your article. We looked at the content in our topical collections to see whether having an abstract makes a difference in usage, and the answer is a resounding yes. Articles with no abstract account for 30% of the content, but for less than 7% of the views. And within a collection, the top articles viewed greater than 50 times with abstracts have 25 times more views than the articles without. And the top article without an abstract has 150 views as compared to the top article with an abstract that has 1,400 views. In our collection of only open access articles on climate change, we saw a similar result. In this collection, it's likely that readers who are browsing content are more willing or more interested or more likely to click on an article with an abstract than one where they have only the title for orientation. So articles with no abstract account for 10% of the content, but for less than 1% of the views. And the top article without an abstract has 93 views as compared to 2,377 for views with an abstract. And so having a very descriptive abstract for your content is extremely helpful for a lot of search engines out there. Much of the content in full text is still very much behind a paywall or behind a kind of a technical PDF wall that makes it difficult for computers to index the full text. And a lot of systems out there have grown up around the only data that is available for a lot of those articles, and that's the abstract. So for one, making sure that you have an abstract available in your Crossref metadata, that you have an abstract for that content at all, and that you share that widely is very important. There is a tool from Crossref that you can use to check your metadata. So a kind of a metadata health check, as it were, called the Crossref participation report. And you can see what percentage of your content has references, open references, ORCID IDs, license URLs, abstracts. Or you can just browse on the ScienceOpen platform and see what your journal metadata looks like in the wild. The initiative for open abstracts has been working hard to encourage publishers to make their abstracts openly available via the Crossref platform. In September 2020, 6.6% of all works with a Crossref DOI and 8.3% of journal articles had abstracts available in Crossref. So you can see that is an extraordinarily low number. Here in orange are some of the publishers who are making their abstracts freely available as part of their Crossref metadata. If you're working with a publisher who does not make the abstracts to your article available, get in touch with them, start that discussion. There's some very big publishers who think that they can potentially earn money based on the abstracts of the article, but this could be doing a disservice to your journal, to your authors. So it's definitely worth at least starting that conversation. So now let's talk about citations. Probably the most important form of currency for researchers and publishers alike. You've all heard of the dreaded impact factor. If systems have to try and compare titles, authors, publication dates to make a best guess if a particular article is being cited without an identifier like a DOI, then a lot of citations can get missed. And citations are really one of the most important ways to measure the relevance of the research that you publish. If your article, chapter, book, poster, report does not have a DOI, you may be missing out on valuable citations and connections. And if Google or Web of Science, Scopus, Dimensions, or ScienceOpen don't pick up on a citation to your work, does it exist? It's the classic question of a tree falling in the wood that no one hears. So each of these systems are more or less depending on the interoperable sharing of data about references. At the moment, we do often get references as part of the Crossref metadata. Here's an example. So for this article, when we queried the Crossref metadata, it came with 53 references as part of the metadata. And you can see then we saw one citation to that. On ScienceOpen, we can use these references as a discovery tool so that so that researchers can really drill down into that reference list and ask things like, oh, what's the most cited article in this reference list? 53 references is a lot to look through. You might want to just be able to put in a search term, or say you only want to see books, or ask a question about what's the oldest or newest citation. So you can see by having that data available, ScienceOpen is able to really open up a whole new discovery space for researchers. And part of this has really been made possible by the Initiative for Open Citations, so the I4OC. As of October 2021, the fraction of publications with open references has grown since the beginning of this initiative from 1% to 88% of the 56.9 million articles. And this is really an amazing achievement. It's incredibly easy. You just have to write an email to support@crossref.org and tell them you want your references to be open. But unfortunately, not all publishers are depositing references with Crossref in the first place. So that's a place to start if your journal is not. And it's definitely not easy. It's definitely not easy. In order for references to be ingested by search engines, some basic information is required. So author first name, last name, article title, journal source, and most importantly, DOI. And only if you add the DOI to your references can you really be sure that a correct link will be made. As editors, I would highly recommend, instead of worrying about a particular reference style with semicolon versus comma or italics versus bold, rather require your authors to chase down the DOIs of the articles, books, or chapters that they cite and submit those with their manuscript. Make the DOI the centerpiece of your reference style. It's definitely the most important part. And make sure that your typesetter is correctly tagging the DOI as a pub ID. DOIs tagged as external links will not be distinguishable from any other web link. And I will tell you, reference tagging is a messy can of worms, and we could really spend all day on it. Most of you will be working with a typesetter for this service, but nevertheless, it's good to keep in mind, have a look at the references, and just keep in mind that making sure that the DOI is really at the center of your reference style, that you use author full name, author instead of an abbreviation. Do always choose a reference style that includes the entire title of the article. There's a lot of reference styles that were created for print to save paper that involve compressing the reference information into as little space as possible, which would be fine if all you did was just, use the DOI, but otherwise it can be really difficult to make those, connections. And this is a super valuable piece of the metadata for you as editors, because you can imagine you've got a new journal, you've got a journal that you want to show off in a special issue. Every article that you cite, potentially that author of that cited article will see that. Potentially they'll say, oh, I didn't know about this journal. Oh, interesting. I've been cited by this person. Oh, I didn't know that. It's a new potential for collaboration, interesting paper. So researchers care about being cited. So you want to take advantage of that and make that as easy as possible for them to see that you have actually cited them. And I do realize that not every field has so many DOIs. Books, it's a relatively new feature that publishers are starting to get DOIs for books. And of course, there's a fair amount of gray literature that your authors cite. But where they cite a journal article, you as an editor should really check and make sure that they are also adding the DOI in there. So on ScienceOpen, we have added a new feature that allows you to validate the references on the platform. So your authors can search for DOIs at Crossref. There's a really nice search interface. They can search on other platforms. Once they have their list of DOIs, it's also possible for either the author or the editor to upload those into ScienceOpen and get a report to make sure that those are really the correct DOIs for the correct reference, to make sure those are valid DOIs, that they're not broken. So that's an extra tool that we have recently added onto the platform. Just navigate, if you're registered on ScienceOpen, just navigate to the dashboard. You can just pop your DOIs in here, submit, and you'll get a report by email about the validation status of those DOIs. So you have your DOI, the persistent identifier for your article. One of the next steps towards better metadata are also the author ID or ORCID. More and more publishers require an ORCID at the point of manuscript submission or publication. So you as an author may have one already. With an ORCID, you can verify that you are the author of this article. So I personally, have published a paper on Drosophila genetics and one about Goethe's Faust, and no AI system in the world is going to guess that those are by the same author, especially as there's a lot of other S. Dawsons, Stephanie Dawsons out there who publish. There's a nurse who does a lot of publishing. So to make sure that your articles are not assigned to a different author with the same name, the ORCID ID is very helpful. But one note about what ORCID is good for and what it's not so good for. Having an ORCID does not take the place of having affiliation data as part of your metadata. So ORCIDs change as researchers' careers grow. An ORCID will can have a whole list of where you did your studies, where you did your postdoc, where you had your junior professor. So your ORCID definitely can grow with your career, but an article that's published at a particular time with a particular resources from a particular institution, that is what you would want to add into that affiliation field. So not where you are now, but where you were when you were actually doing that research. So you can imagine just having an ORCID isn't going to replace saying, okay, this research was done at, University of South Africa. On your ORCID profile, you can also add a lot of other information such as biography and employment, grant, etc. Again, when creating an ORCID, it's rather important to use the DOIs of the publications so that they can then again be verified in systems such as ScienceOpen. We often see authors type in the title and date of their publications, and those create errors that prevent us from aggregating those articles together. We see every kind of typo in the world on ScienceOpen. So from that perspective, again, the DOI is super important, and how these different persistent identifiers work together to really make sure that everybody gets credit for the work that they've done is super important. And by linking your publication list on ORCID to your ScienceOpen profile, lets other users explore your articles, and you can sort by altmetric score, citations, and more. So there's some real advantages for authors using ORCID. And this is one of the reasons why on ScienceOpen we require an ORCID for anybody who's publishing anything, who wants to be an editor, who wants to write a review. We really are trying to raise the awareness of researchers about the value of these persistent identifiers, about the value of using ORCID, about the value of using DOIs. So sometimes it may seem like a difficult extra step. We have usually in our registration process, the biggest hurdle is remembering your ORCID password. But certainly we are trying to encourage the entire community to these more interoperable practices that will help everybody to get more credit for their work, because even when people tell you that they can't be bothered, they don't want to, it's too much work to work with persistent identifiers, those researchers nevertheless, you know, go and suddenly ask themselves, oh, what's my H index? Oh, I wonder how many mentions there have been of my paper. So even when people think that they don't want to use it, when they see what it's good for, then they can often be convinced. And there's a couple other, there are a couple other persistent identifiers out there, such as the ORCIDs, which are for institutes. So those are similar to ORCID, an institutional identifier to make sure that there's not a typo, to make sure that that the University College London isn't confused with a college in France, to make sure that the University of South Africa is not confused with the University of South Australia. And there's another important identifier, fundref. That is, again, a persistent identifier for funders to make sure that Wellcome Trust can see, oh, these are all of the researchers, these are all of the articles that were produced from our grants. Oh, these are all of the articles produced from our grants last year, the year before. Everybody wants to be able to answer these kinds of questions. And I get asked all the time from universities, oh, would you be able to give me a list of all of the open access publications that have come from our faculty, staff, and students? This is really difficult because, like I said, in a lot of cases, that affiliation data is not filled in. Other institutes will ask, oh, could you make a list of all of the sustainable development content? This would be a really interesting project. Half of those articles don't have any abstracts or keywords, so there's no possible way to know if they really are a good match there. So the things that we're trying to do in aggregating this content and bringing this content together is to be able to support the kind of search queries that institutes, funders, authors are trying to ask. And we want your journal content to be found in those searches. And the best way to make that happen is to have richer metadata. So I could talk about metadata all day, but I'm going to end here. My take-home message: discoverability is about making sure that the machines can find your work and make sense of it. And as an aggregator of information, ScienceOpen will continue to open up, share, add to, and explore the context of scholarly research in support of open knowledge goals.